Translation by Rosa Maria Martinez Herrera, September 29th, 2019. A brief history of translation up to the 1980s. In ancient Rome, the Romans brought forward the idea that translation is not carried out by finding equivalents between words. What the Romans said about translations, sense for sense, meaning for meaning, did make a lot of sense. The only problem is to determine what meaning is, sentence, utterance, and functional meanings. A summary of modern approaches. Quine in 1960 presented the idea that there is no such thing as equivalence. It does not matter at which level it is positive, the existence of equivalence. Word for word, phrase for phrase, sentence for sentence. There will always be a problem of referentially and indeterminacy, dependent on text type and the target of the translation. Translability. Translation as a science has gone through the same process as literatures before literary studies were accepted as science. Just as with the production of literature or literary creation, the production of a translation, the act of translation, how a text is taken from a source language to a target language is an art or a skill and difficult to analyze except with the help of new cognitive theories. The notion of translation is used to refer to a variety of different phenomena, and no consensus exists as yet as to what existing definition refers to. Translating or translation. The chronological approach to translation studies would produce an extremely muddled exposition when ideas and hypotheses from the 80s onwards are approached. Holmes published a diagram of translation studies in 1988. However, he did not consider translation as a tool for language teaching and learning, and is expanded into a new diagram that looks as follows. The process translating, the practical approach, determines how to transfer the contents of the source into the target, therefore deals with the process of translating. Models for translating. The linguistic model studies the linguistic sources of the source and the target languages, and the mechanisms available in the target language for overcoming the structural differences between source and the target that appear in translation. The text linguistic model takes into account the various uses of language by speakers and writers in articular communicative situations. The expansions of translation studies into discourse analysis and pragmatics have shown that what a translator does is not exactly transfer of meaning. It is the communicative values of the source text that are transferred. Sociocultural translation advocates maintain that translation should always read like translations. It must be an oblique rendering of the source. Lawrence Venturi in The Translator's Invisibility said that translators should not be invisible and that the reader should be allowed to appreciate the source of culture. Newbert and Shreve do not agree with this type of translation and say that if translators understand cultural difference, Why can't the sources of the target language be enlisted in this service? The computational model. It was thought at the time of appearance of machine translation that it would take over the job of all except literary translating. This was found to be impossible as cultural and context-dependent elements were too difficult even for the most capable supercomputer. Human post-editing can nowadays improve machine translation. The formal equivalences on which the machine relies are equivalences between the source and the target languages. The psycholinguistic model. It understands of the ST, transcoding second language into target language and formulating TT. The cognitive substract should be matched with the pedagogical concepts to explain, for example, transposition, modulation, equivalence, and the other so-called translation strategies are psychologically realized. Interdisciplinary models is mainly directed to evaluating literary translation, as the idea of polysystem posits the existence of a canonized literature and non-canonized literature which tries to displace the established system by means of the introduction of translated works. As linguistic system, pragmatic constraints, word knowledge, and meaning systems all converge in the act of translation, it is a synthetic process which implies dynamic matching of such systems by the translator. The critical approach. The critical approach proposes a finished translation. There is a difference between literary criticism of translation and translation criticism. The first focuses on the literary or textual qualities of the work as it exists in translation. The translation is judged on its one merit as a target language text. Translation criticism, on the other hand, appraises the text as a translation. Frames. This is the basics for Newbert's idea of frames. The description of grammar and lexicon needs a description of the cognitive and interactional frames in terms of the language user interprets his environment, formulates his own message, understands the message of others, and accumulates or creates an internal model of his world. Translation theory today. Present translation theory is mainly concerned with translation criticism, but it goes one step further. There are some questions that are often asked. 1. What do we want to preserve in the target text of what is in the source text? 2. Do all foreign values disappear? 3. Is everything of value bound to be linguistic form? 4. Can information content be separated from linguistic and textual form? Overt versus covert translation. According to House 1981, covert translation takes place when a translation is not marked as a translated text of a source text but may have been created in its own right. In overt translation, different cultural presuppositions in the two language communities have to be taken into account. Do all foreign values disappear in translation? Socialization brings with it a patterning of text according to cultural conventions. Textual knowledge is cultural bound. This is extremely relevant for literary translation, but is also relevant when translating text with an ideological heart. Pragmatics. Not everything we wish to express is encoded in language. Presupposition and inference play a great role in retrieving utterance meanings. To create a target language which is functionally equivalent to the second text, text type and register have to be carefully preserved. Literary text and specialist text. Works of fiction, they are supposedly different in context and in form. In real life, such a distinction is quite often very difficult to draw, as the rhetoric of fiction can be used in highly specialized publications. A transformation requires two operations, present in all types of language, metonym, indirect description, and metaphor, verbal equation. Texts that reflect the unique expertise of specific authors and also special purposes in their textual organization, such as scientific texts, legal documents, commercial transactions, with strict and highly predictable norms of presentation and register. The intelligibility of connected discourse depends on the breadth of mutual knowledge and is continually expanded by the creation of association ties between items in the sequential flow of the text. Texts normally relate interest by their information content and not by their contextual appearance. The translator's competence. The competence of the translator is not just knowledge of the two languages systems, but also communicative language. Communicative knowledge is knowing how to use language in a specific situation of interaction between human beings. Translation competence is the sum total of what a translator needs to know and needs to know how to do in order to translate. A common mistake is to believe that any person with linguistic competence in two languages can translate automatically. Translating and interpreting require specialist knowledge and certain skills that are in no way innate. They have to be learned. Teaching translation, which is usually done under the auspices of university, translation and interpreting degrees have become increasingly popular in Europe as jobs have been created for translation and interpreting within the European Union. There is also increasing awareness of the importance of the different modes of translating for interpreting, of which the best known, literary translation, occupies only a tiny slot. The preparation of future professionals include intensive work with languages, which has clear implications for insights into foreign language teaching and learning. Teaching future professionals. The study of translation and interpreting has its own goal, the use of language as a tool on a future professional activity, and the component of reflection on language as a tool in the future professional activity, and the component of reflection in the present in the philologia degree course is absent from it. Translators need to focus on the practical aspects of total proficiency in their source language and their target language together with the techniques used in translation. For interpreters, interpreting skills have to be acquired before entering professional activities. It is true that proficiency in the foreign language is absolutely necessary for translation, but it's no less true that excellent command of the translator's mother tongue is even more important. Social knowledge is extremely important in translating. More than translating language, the translator is immersed in a kind of cultural transfer which requires him to be bicultural more than bilingual. Difficulties when translating. 1. The lack of proficiency in the target language. The comparative and descriptive analysis of translation products show that this is a source of translation errors that are not readily apparent, as syntax and lexicon are usually correct and the text makes sense. 2. The lack of proficiency in the source language. The most common example of blatantly inadequate and inappropriate translations are the tourist folders printed all over the world. 3. Lack of intercultural competence or sensitivity. A text may show little awareness of the cultural context in which it is meant to be read. Translation as a language teaching tool. Translation is a school of interpretation and re-expression based on knowledge of language and facts. Translation is looked at from the point of view of learning language. In the general foreign language classroom, both at school and at university, not of how to become a professional translator. 2. Awareness of context and form. Most language-bound items will translate into the student's mother language, but translators should be aware that translations can make a different form. 3. Cognitive psychological reasons. As soon as a student starts learning to read and write, awareness of language as an object exists more often than not. In an unconscious way, they translate consciously. Steps to translation. 1. Preparatory exercises. First, the students learn to become aware of whether or not they have captured the original author's intended meaning. Summary. Translation and the comparison of translation gives students consciousness of second language acquisition by encouraging students to observe and analyze real language for themselves. Parallel text. Parallel texts exist but are, as a rule, literary text or extracts from literary text. The level of such text is often too high for the majority of secondary school students, but there are many different text types that can be used, like publicity, instructions, guides, etc. Translation from the first language to the second language. Inverse translation should not be attempted at the lower levels of language instruction. Textual features, a list of traps and pitfalls. Very long sentences that cannot be split easily become of a proposition, parentheses, relative clauses, etc. Sentences without a main clause. Technical terms, often terms form one discipline, are not all the same in another. Ambiguity, nuance, other false friends. Redundancy or repetition. Register, including stylistic devices. Idioms, colloquialisms, proverbs saying that do not have a standard translation. Humor, puns, irony, neologisms, untranslatable terms where use of a second language is culture specific. Other abbreviations. Process versus product. It is It is not the product that is important, but the whole process. The correction or post-correction stage is an ideal opportunity for students for further contrast between different versions of summary translation. Conclusion. Finally, the use of translation in second language acquisition is a tool, not an end of it in itself. It is just one of the many methods that exist to help students learn and appreciate a foreign language. It is recommended that translation should not be used as a means of testing for grades. That could kill the students' spontaneity and openness, essential ingredients for healthy language learning.